Okay, so let's get started. It's 6:04, so let me formally start. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 62nd Annual Bishop Hurst Lecture, organized by the Department of Philosophy and Religion at American University. My name is Jin Park. I'm the chair of the department. I'd like to thank you for joining today's event, which is our most distinguished lecture series. Before I introduce you about the Bishop Hurst Lecture Series itself, I'd like to take a moment to make two brief acknowledgements. First, American University is located on the territories of the Piscataway, Powhatan, and the Nanticoke people. We recognize that our ability to gather here today is due to the continued occupation of this land. Second, Bishop John Fletcher Hurst, who founded American University in 1893, was a slaveholder in a post-emancipation economy. We recognize that American University benefited both directly and indirectly from wealth gained through slavery. In recognizing that this land is colonized indigenous territory that has been crafted through slave and indentured labor, it is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate the histories and afterlives of these events and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. As hosts of the Bishop Hurst Lecture, we commit to use this platform to resist the legacies of racism and settler colonialism in the academy in general and in philosophy and religion in particular. So today we are not physically on the land of American University, but I think this statement still is very relevant and also very much relevant to the topics of tonight. The Bishop Hurst Lecture started in 1958. For over a half a century, the lecture brought distinguished scholars to AU campus for intellectual exchange of ideas on the topics that are very much relevant to our time. The first speaker in 1958 was Walter Kaufman, and since then we had a distinguished scholar every year, such as Lester McIntyre or Rome Hare, who also taught in our department, and Alison Jagger, just to name a few. Last year, because of the pandemic, the lecture had to be canceled at the last minute. But this year, even virtually, we can hold this conference, the lecture. So we have an honor of having Dr. Peter Hershock, who will deliver a talk about diversity, a topic that is very relevant to our society at the moment, and also a key concept of American University's education of inclusive excellence. So without further ado, let me invite my colleague, Professor Perry John, Director of Undergraduate Studies in Philosophy, to formally introduce today's speaker. He will also moderate the Q&A after the talk.
Thanks so much, Jin. It's my honor to introduce Peter Hershock for us today. Peter is Director of the Asian Studies Development Program and Education Specialist at the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. His expertise focuses on globalization and comparative higher education, contemporary Buddhist thought, ethics, and social justice, and cultural diversity. In his work, he designs and directs higher education faculty and institutional development programs that seek to mainstream the study of Asian cultures and societies in undergraduate classrooms. In connection with his work in the professional development program at the center, he has collaborated in designing and hosting international education leadership programs and research seminars that critically examine the relationships among higher education, globalization, equity, and diversity. Most recently, he has launched the center's initiative on humane artificial intelligence with a focus on the societal impacts and ethical issues raised by these emerging technologies. Trained in Asian and comparative philosophy, his research and writing draw on Buddhist conceptual resources to reflect on and address contemporary issues of global concern. He's produced numerous publications, and I'll highlight two recent books this year, Buddhism and Intelligent Technology Toward a More Humane Future with Bloomsbury Press, and then Human Being or Human Becoming, a conversation with Confucianism on the concept of person. So Peter, we're really lucky to have you. Excited to hear what you have to share with us today.
Still had myself muted. Thanks very much for the kind introduction. And I do very much wish that I could be there, actually in DC with all of you, going out for a drink afterward, enjoying some of the great cuisine that DC has to offer. But alas, we'll have to leave that for another occasion. I want to begin with mentioning a simple core Buddhist teaching that for the purpose of ending conflict, trouble, and suffering, we should see all things as impermanent. And as the phrasing of this teaching makes pretty clear, I think, its primary point is not theoretical, but therapeutic. Most often it gets interpreted as a kind of an advice to not hold on to people, to states of affairs, encouragement, you might say, to practice the quietest art of non-attachment. But I think it can also be interpreted in an activist way, as a challenge to see that if everything is impermanent, that means everything's already in a process of change. So we really have no basis for claiming about any situation that we find ourselves in that it's intractable, that there's nothing that can be done about it, that it can't be turned around, that we can't make a significant difference. The only really relevant question is not, can change happen, but change in what direction? And this last year has been really a remarkable year with respect to change. I think that the degree to which we've been forced to let go of normalcy and certainty and to start reflecting on whether things are changing the way in which we'd like them to change has been really quite remarkable. The COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement have brought into really sharp and tragic focus the fact that diversity concerns are not just about identity. They're about precarity and about equity. And freedom from both prescribed and ascribed identities, the right to differ, to choose who we want to be, that may be one of the great achievements of liberalism. But it seems as if grounding this right, the right to differ, in a conception of persons as autonomous individuals, has often led to a truncated exercise as merely the right to differ from others. Now, doing so is obviously infinitely preferable to forced conformity. If we truly were nothing other than individually existing human beings, not human becomings, but human beings, that might be good enough. But what if we're not individual human beings? What if we, in fact, are relationally constituted human becomings? Tonight, what I want to do is to suggest that precarity and inequity, made so painfully apparent by the pandemic and by the Black Lives Matter movement, are symptomatic of deficient understandings of personhood and difference. I want to try to make clear that we're not just interdependent and relationally constituted human becomings, but interpenetrating, and to stress that exercising the right to differ from others very often and very quickly devolves into exclusionary divisiveness and partiality if it's not paired with the complementary obligation to differ for others. So diversity matters, but only when it is conceived and valued as crucial to the relational materialization of ever greater equity, where I'll argue that equity consists in the improvised and compassionately open-ended practice of systematically enhancing qualities of inclusion. It's not counting or compensation that ultimately makes a difference, but caring. Concepts have histories, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that concepts have lifetimes. Some, like equity and freedom, have very long and colorful lives. Others are still in their infancy. But the birth of the contemporary concept of diversity, I think, can arguably trace back to 1962 with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, a book that married just nascent science of ecology with the growing environmental movement. Not too long after that, in the early 60s, diversity, as you know, was adopted and nurtured by the civil rights movement, the women's movements, and later by those who champion multiculturalism and social justice, to the point that today, anywhere you go, any media that you turn on, I don't think you probably will go a day without hearing the word diversity. It's invoked as an important concern and value in education, and the workplace, and the arts, culture, and politics. And I want to be a bit of a devil's advocate and ask why. I mean, if diversity is just a numeric measure of multiplicity, if it just means having people with different identities, people with different cultural backgrounds, people with different historical backgrounds present in the same place together, why should that matter? Why should it be valued? More isn't always better. I mean, if you put more food on the table, it's not necessarily going to make for a better meal. More students in a classroom, anyone who's done undergraduate education knows a classroom of 15 people is much preferable to one of 1,500 people. So simple multiplicity, simply having lots of different people gather together, clearly is not what's at stake here. I reflect back on the fact that, yes, if we're talking about a logic of proportionality, representation, it's certainly better to have representation in classrooms, boardrooms, courtrooms, than to not have representation. The logic of proportionality does make sense, and that is about numbers. But I remember 50 years ago, my high school in Tampa, Florida was forcibly integrated by busing Black students across town into a previously all-white high school in the country club district of the city. It's not surprising that a lot of riots ensued. Windows, were broken, tables were thrown out of the windows, fights broke out, knives were brandished. Nobody was permanently injured, but a lot of stuff happened. 50 years later, some of the multiracial friendships that were developed at that point in time, they persist. Met a friend of mine, good friend of mine in Atlanta, just a couple of months ago or during the pandemic, who a friend of mine made on the football field. Black kid bused across campus. Busing ended Black exclusion from that school and from all of Tampa's public schools. It was no longer possible after that moment to have Blacks excluded from public schools. And if student counts were all that mattered, if it was just a matter of getting students in the classroom, getting them integrated into the school itself, that could actually start movement in the direction of social justice and ending precarity, we'd be in good shape today. Tampa remains divided. Tampa's neighborhoods remain divided. It's better than it was 50 years ago, but it's not good enough. Simply bringing people together was not good enough 50 years ago. It's not good enough now. It'll never be good enough. For diversity initiatives to bring about the kind of changes that we want, the standard quantitative conception of diversity needs to be retired and replaced by a qualitative one. And to help explain why and to kind of cash that out a bit for you, I want to build on two basic Buddhist insights. The first insight is that all things arise and are sustained interdependently. And strongly interpreted, that means that relationality is more basic than things related. Interdependence is not a contingent external relationship among essentially separate entities. It's internal or constitutive. So that taking the individual, whether we're talking about individual persons, an individual identity group, an individual society, a nation state, a corporation, and assuming that the individual is the natural basic unit of analysis, whether we're doing ethics, whether we're talking economics or politics, is like eating soup with a fork. You end up missing the defining features of what the dish is. The second insight is that our conflicts, trouble, and sufferings are relational distortions that can only be sustainably addressed on the basis of things as they have come to be. That is, histories matter. But from a Buddhist perspective, histories are not the products just of material causal sequences or of chance or of the possibility of something like fate, but rather they're a function of karma, where contrary to the sort of popular culture understanding of karma as something like destiny or a simple what goes around comes around sort of ethos, Buddhist karma, I think, is best presented as a conditional, that if we pay close and sustained enough attention, it becomes evident that a dynamic consonance obtains among the patterns of our values, intentions, and actions, and the patterns of outcome and opportunity that we experience. Given a karmic view of the cosmos, experienced realities always imply responsibility and are always open to revision. It is always possible to change our values, our intentions, and the actions that are based on them, so that ultimately there's no ontological gap between the space of causes and the space of intentions or the space of reasons. And from a Buddhist perspective, ontology supervenes on axiology, Metaphysics is maybe a species of ethics. Taken together, these insights imply that we're always the patients of our own actions and their impacts on others, including those that differentiate us from them. In fact, given that interdependence is a constitutive relationship, if everything is really interdependent, constitutively, everything is interpenetrating dynamically, and each thing ultimately is what it means for all others. That is, the limits that we place on what things or people mean to us affects what they can be relationally. We are significantly responsible for who others are for us. Now, from a Buddhist perspective, difference, like everything else, is dynamic and relational. And I think a qualitative distinction that's quite useful can be drawn between the occurrence of difference marked by distinguishing variety and diversity. Variety is a quantitative measure of multiplicity. It's a function of simple coexistence. Variety is present whenever things differ from each other. It can be seen at a glance. It can be imposed at will. Diversity, I want to suggest, is a qualitative index of the degree to which differences expand relational opportunity and serve as the basis for mutual contribution to sustainably shared flourishing. Diversity is a function of coordination enriching interdependence. Diversity only emerges then when things differ significantly for one another, not just from each other. It's a relational achievement. It cannot be seen at a glance, and it cannot be imposed. So when we talk about a diverse campus, and we do that, we say we're going to achieve a diverse campus by ensuring we have students from so many different national groups, who represent so many different ethnicities, who have so many different kinds of adopted identities and so on. This is not diversity yet. This is mere variety. To kind of make the distinction, I think, really quite sharp, we could contrast what's going on in zoos and ecosystems, where even the best of zoos can do nothing more than exhibit externally sustained species variety. Ecosystems express species diversity. In an ecosystem, species matter to each other constitutively. In zoos, they do not. Now, this relational qualitative conception of diversity calls into question the numbers game of counting representatives of different cultural, ethnic, or identity groups. To differ from others in ways that alleviate conflict, trouble, and suffering, it's necessary to discern how best to differ for them as well. And this suggests the need to significantly rethink both the meanings of and the means to equity and social justice. Today, equity is typically taken to consist in something like the fair distribution of the benefits and burdens of social existence, a goal that's assumed reachable by means of respecting both equality and identity, that is, enacting commitments on one hand to common principles and the ideal of universality, and on the other hand to uncommon practices and the reality of human differences. So inequalities that are due to disparities in individual efforts or endowments are considered to be natural and can be deemed fair. Inequalities due to structural or institutional biases are not. So under this understanding, achieving equity consists in realizing the conditions in which all individuals are ensured equal access or rights to participation, rights to participate in education, in business, in politics, and so on. So the goal is realizing universal non-exclusion, equality of opportunity. Methodologically, what that means is making comparative assessments of the status of various individuals. Could be persons, could be ethnic groups, minority groups, genders, nations, etc., with respect to some social variable, education, income, health. Now, this comparative conception of equity has played a crucial role in coordinating efforts to redress the historical injustices that have been based on, for example, differences in gender, ethnicity, religion. But equality has been and remains a fiction. And fictions can be powerfully inspiring. Their power, however, is never absolute and it's never eternal. Central to the fiction of equality of opportunity is the presumed independence rather than constitutive interdependence of the individuals whose welfare is being compared. And in fact, I would argue that the fiction of equal opportunity becomes a lie when it's paired with the conviction that individual effort determines outcomes and with ignorance of the complex relational constraints that are placed on agency by social structures and institutions. Equality of opportunity is going to remain a fiction, and a pernicious one, as long as it remains wedded to valorizing individual achievement over relational transformation. We have glass ceilings, and I would argue that the persistence of the glass ceilings in our societies around the world ultimately may have a lot less to do with institutional or historical inertia than they do with conceptual anemia. A Buddhist alternative is to see equity as a relational function of capacities for and commitments to furthering our own personal interests in ways that are deemed valuable by others. As such, equity is not a function of difference leveling effects of minimizing exclusion, but rather of difference appreciating effects of enhancing qualities of inclusion. Equity understood in this relational sense is an index of how well social relations are fostering meaningful mutual contribution. In short, increasing equity entails enhancing diversity, understood relationally and qualitatively. So rather than a benchmark comparative measure of the status of different individuals, persons, communities, classes, etc., equity is a dynamic function of interpersonal and institutional responsiveness. Non-exclusion is crucial. Non-exclusion is crucial to the pursuit of equity when understood in a comparative sense or a relational sense. It's a sort of a bottom line, a benchmark. But it's not enough to simply make space for those who differ. It's necessary to appreciate, that is, to both value and add value to their difference. To work on behalf of greater equity is thus to be implicated in a labor that is irreducibly both caring and creative. Now, it's often presumed that when working on behalf of greater diversity and equity, our efforts are going to cash out practically in heightened tolerance and expanded freedoms of choice for those who have previously suffered the relational harm of systemic exclusion. And to be sure, tolerance is preferable to intolerance. Freedom of choice is preferable to its absence. Tolerance and choice are good for us as individuals. But for us as persons in dynamic community with others, they're not good enough. To see why, recall that in a karmic context, our values-informed actions affect changes in the environmental and relational context that we find ourselves in, such that we become the patients of our own exercises of agency. In a karmically configured world, choice and control have somewhat ironic value. To get better at getting what we want, we have to get better at wanting, that is, feeling a lack. But to get better at wanting then entails being unable to finally want what we get. That's a cycle of deepening dissatisfaction or lack, even in the midst of apparent plenty. And no less ironically, while valuing choice seems to be a good thing, it does result in increasing the objective occasions that we have for exercising our freedoms of choice. But eventually, fed back as part of our environmental context, we end up living in environments in which choosing becomes compulsory. And if choosing is not done under conditions of equal knowledge, equal wisdom, under institutional constraints of any kind that would conflate values that are unproductive for the individual making choices, being compelled to choose is itself an injustice. Likewise for the karma of control. To get better at exercising control, we have to experience our situations as being ever in further need of control. And the result of that is ending up living in controlled circumstances that are ironically always risking going out of control, a cycle of deepening insecurity. And this is something that we see playing out not just at a personal level, but you could see this in international relations. The insecurity of the United States based on the kinds of policies that it had in terms of international relations exerting its power over what's happening in other countries. It's a bad mix from a Buddhist perspective. So from a Buddhist perspective in which agents, actions, and patience are aspects of a dynamically evolving whole, freedom can't be something that I or you have as individuals. Freedom is not reducible to choice or to something that be given or that could be claimed as a right. We are not born free. Freedom is a relational quality that has to be cultivated through systematically undertaken bodily, emotional, intellectual, and social practices. Freedom ultimately is embodying appreciative and contributory virtuosity. It can't be measured in terms of how many choices we have, or how much control we can exert, or the degrees of independence that we presumably enjoy. It can only be evaluated in terms of how deeply we are committed and how well we contribute to dissolving the conditions of conflict, trouble, and suffering. Stated in more positive and specifically Buddhist terms, freedom consists in both capacities for and commitments to realizing kushala or superlative relational dynamics. Where the kushala-akushala distinction is not a dichotomous contrast of what's good and what's evil. Kushala means something like superlative, it's excellence, it's virtuosity. So to contrast kushala and akushala is to contrast what's virtuosic from everything that on today's spectrum counts as good, mediocre, and bad. Extending and enhancing inclusion in ways that are consistent with relational equity and diversity, thus neither requires nor results in power, where power is the ability to act unilaterally and to control situational dynamics determining how things turn out. It requires and results instead in strength, where strength is embodying the improvisational ability that's needed in any given situation to realize truly shared and superlative arcs of relational transformation. As it is implied in the Bodhisattva ideal of Mahayana Buddhism, the ideal is one of contributory virtuosity rather than control. Realizing a more equitable world is not a finite game. It's not an endeavor that can be undertaken in order to finish and win. From a Buddhist perspective, realizing a more equitable world is an infinite game. Like a marriage, like a friendship, that we enter into and that we play in order to improve the quality of play and to intensify the interest and the shared commitments of everybody involved. Conceiving of equity, diversity, and freedom in this relational manner opens what I would refer to as a middle path to social justice. The term middle path, of course, is a metaphor for Buddhist practice or the therapeutic cultivation of the kind of presence that's needed to realize liberating patterns of interdependence. Like the Aristotelian mean, it implies a strategic commitment to moderation and compromise, and that's often presented in stories about the Buddha's own life, with his striking a balance between asceticism and hedonism. But at a more theoretically productive and I think conceptually accurate level of describing the middle path, it's a threefold strategy. It consists in recognizing the merits of opposing positions or perspectives. The classic one in the Buddha's own day was the contrast between those who believed in the existence of an eternal soul and the materialist annihilationists who said, with the demise of the body, consciousness disappeared, mind is God, there is no soul. So two diametrically opposed positions. So the Buddhist middle path is to first recognize that each of these opposing positions has its merits. There are arguments to be made on behalf of each of them. The second step, though, is to resist their universalization or their claims to sufficiency. The third step is to then redirect relational dynamics at a tangent to their opposition to yield superlative or kushala, virtuosic outcomes and opportunities. So recognizing the practice, a middle path strategy means working obliquely or orthogonally to the polar tension between individual biased, universalist, and particularist conceptions of justice. Theories of justice have generally been concerned with what we owe one another, what obligations we might have to treat each other fairly in various domains, and what people are due or what they're entitled to. Universalist theorizing determines what is due to any individual. Particularist theorizing determines what's due to an individual, person, group, etc. Maybe the most single influential universalist conception of justice is that of John Rawls, who argued that justice is most reliably achieved by making decisions about how to build a just and flourishing society from behind an imagined veil of ignorance. So it's a rational route to justice that's based on each and every one of us having an equal chance of occupying any position within the society that results from our deliberations. The aim, maximizing choice and fairness, minimizing constraints on opportunity. As feminist and post-colonial critics of Rawls have insisted, though, to be practically useful, routes to justice have to be built in consideration of the differences in historical experience, in developmental trajectories, and identity. Kind of like an extension of the Aristotelian notion that equity is a corrective for the wrongs that can be done when laws are applied universally with blindness to the concrete particulars. What feminist post-colonial critics are arguing, what particularist justice is about, is maximizing the recognition of and respect for differences, while minimizing the potential tyranny of the majority and eliminating constraints on individual choice. And I think compelling cases can be made for the practical merits of both universalist and particularist conceptions of justice. They have both done good work. But here we are in 2021, and 60 years after the beginning of the civil rights movement in the US, the women's rights movements, the many movements that have happened since then on behalf of social justice. We still do not live in a world in which we are free of race, class, identity-based oppression. We are not. And so the possibility is that maybe their conceptions of justice and how to arrive at it are in some way flawed. Buddhism offers prospects for a relational alternative, a path to justice that's based on expanding considerations of relevance, responsibility, and readiness to exemplify Mahakaruna, great compassion. Where compassion is not just a social emotion as defined by Martha Nussbaum, something that's based on rational judgments regarding the serious and undeserved nature of other suffering, and the fact that they matter to us in some way in terms of our own aims and interests. Rather, from a Buddhist perspective, compassion is a social therapeutic. It's a practice of transformative and healing social action that's rooted in caring insight into the differentially inflected interdependence and interpenetration of all things. Now, universalists and particularist conceptions of justice have in common this ideal of non-exclusion and an association of freedom with individual agency. An ideal of realizing the conditions in which everyone has equivalent opportunity to assert his or her or their own self-interest, making causally effective choices about who or what to do or be. All well and good. Injustice is, in essence, the restriction of choice and assertive control. The ideal of relational justice is different, though, in emphasizing the realization of superlative relational dynamics or arcs of change, while dissolving those conditions for realizing akusala arcs of change. That is, arcs of change that today would be considered good or mediocre or bad. So the Buddhist ideal of relational justice is not merely of ensuring that everybody receives the humane minimum that they're due, but of progressively expanding relational freedoms. Injustice, then, is at root the attenuation of contributory capacities and commitments. The work of justice from a Buddhist perspective is not a compensatory mechanism. It's a creative practice in which the right to differ from others is blended compassionately into the obligation to differ for them in ways that contribute to ever more profoundly shared and progressively liberating relational dynamics. These Buddhist intuitions about justice share with feminism and post-colonialism a recognition of the need of drawing aside the veil of ignorance that enables social separation and segregation, and that make plausible the fiction of individual independence and the tragedy of justified irresponsibility. They're also broadly aligned with arguments against decoupling the cultural politics of identity from the social politics of equality, and they're aligned with arguments for both the personal right to differ as well as the social obligation to close the gap between subjective claims for recognition and respect and objective claims for redistribution. But in the context that we live in today, of the choice proliferating, disinformation-riddled expansion of the global attention economy, and the algorithmic tailoring of human experience, Buddhism also points distinctively, I think, to the critical importance of cultivating and maintaining what I would argue is our most basic freedom, and that is freedom of attention. Attention is, after all, our most basic human capital. It's the most basic resource that's needed to make any meaningful difference in our own lives or in the lives of others. Without freedom of attention, there's no freedom of intention. Without freedom of intention, ethics, that is the art of human course correction, is impossible. Working for greater equity, diversity, and justice is not a labor that we can expect to finish. Although setting quantitative benchmarks can be conventionally useful, there are ultimately no success conditions for this work. There are only improvement conditions. Improvement conditions that are indexed to how virtuosically we're able to differ from and to differ for one another. This is an intergenerational labor. It's going to play out over decades, over centuries. It's an open-ended adventure in creatively trying to expand the relational possibilities for freely engaging one another in the joint project of eliminating the conditions for conflict, trouble, and suffering, but on the more positive side, creating the conditions for virtuosic relationality, for being able to improvise in any situation that we find ourselves in a way that adds aesthetically, that adds ethically, that adds morally to the context that we find ourselves in. That, I think, is the real promise of diversity and of inclusion, and of seeking equity as quality of inclusion, not just having people at the table, not just bringing us all together, but figuring out how best to mobilize our own contributory possibilities in ways that create the conditions of shared flourishing. Thank you very much.
Huge thanks, Peter, for all of that. Folks, we have lots of time for Q&A, but also just broader discussion. If you would, feel free to actually use your raise your hand, and I'll be able to see that in physically, or you can raise your hand electronically through your little box here, and I'll see that here on the side to call on you. But thoughts, questions, ways you want to kick off the discussion. Megan, yes, go for it.
Hi. So first of all, thank you. That was really interesting. I have two questions, if that's okay. One just to clarify, to help me wrap my head around the view, and then one just a question about maybe an extension of the notion of justice that you're proposing here. So the clarifying question is, so early on in the talk, you talked about us, let me find exactly what you said here, but something about there was no distinction, or there was no ontological gap between causality and intentionality. And I was hoping maybe you could say a little bit more about what you meant by that. And then the extension, this isn't really like a challenge or a criticism, just I'm curious what you would say. And I think there is an answer to it. But the notion of justice that we get, there's a note like reciprocity to it. And sometimes we talk about environmental justice, so that we have maybe an obligation, if you want to cash it out in the way, but at the very least that there's a way that we can behave that would do justice to the environment. And I'm just wondering if you think that you can extend that notion there, maybe, even though maybe there's a sense in which we don't have reciprocity, though maybe there's a sense in which we do.
Yeah, I think the reciprocity, starting with the sort of last part first. If you take the Buddhist perspective of horizonless interdependence and interpenetration, we're already connected with our environments, urban environments, domestic environments, natural environments, etc. And our responsibilities don't end at our doorstep. I mean, we have responsibilities for all of the environments that we participate in. So from a Buddhist perspective, what humanity has been doing to the environment, especially since the Industrial Revolutions, plural, began a couple hundred years ago, has been really detrimental to the flourishing of other species and to ecosystems at large. And that's something we have to take responsibility for, not because we owe the world anything, but because the world is constitutive of who we are. And a degraded environment is an index of degraded forms of consciousness. So to live in a degraded environment, whether it's a domestic one, rife with domestic violence, or it's an urban environment in which there's rubbish in the streets, in which you don't have decent sanitation, to have an urban, a natural environment in which species are losing their ability to contribute to one another in the way that allows the ecosystem to stay viable, then we have a responsibility to intervene in that across all those different spectrums of environment. And it kind of connects to the first question about the difference between space of causes and the space of intentions or reasons. If you take this karmic perspective seriously, what is consciousness? Consciousness is the differentiation of matter and what matters. Consciousness is that relationship, the differentiation of matter and what matters. And so intentionality, when we bring things into being, we engage the circumstance that we find ourselves in, differentiating between different elements of our environment. We're structuring our environment through the differentiations that we make within it. So we call some things food, some things are poison, really basic differentiation. And environments start to develop and evolve complexly to structure themselves along with consciousness. So from a Buddhist perspective, there's no beginning of the cosmos. What we have is this prospect of consciousness, differentiation, value-driven, intention-driven, that then plays out as what's structuring the environments within which we find ourselves present. So it's in that sense that we are always creating the conditions environmentally through choices that we're making, the values that inform our actions. We then create the conditions of living in the environments that we do, which are then feeding back to us the effects of those particular values. If they're good, we probably continue with it. If they start to mess up the way we're doing things, we should stop. But humanity somehow has lots of reasons for convincing itself we should just stay on the path that we're on and things will suddenly start getting better. It's a bit of an illusory dynamic that I guess we have. So I think that distinction between ontology and axiology is one where, from a Buddhist perspective, the valuation comes first, because that's what drives the differentiations, without which individual things are not being abstracted from the relational dynamics that we find ourselves a part of. So it's that abstraction of individual entities and identifying these as preferable, those as not preferable, that creates the structuring in the environments, the space of causes that we find ourselves in. It's a recursive feedback loop.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Bro, yeah.
Hi. So building off that idea of differentiation of different concepts, in your book on diversity and variety, you talk about how the Chinese conceptualize the difference between a human and a horse, how it's not, there are certain structures or essences that distinguish these two things, but rather that they behave differently in certain circumstances. And so I see that as an action rather than like a thing. For a lot of us, we value diversity and equity as things, but it's harder to put that into action in a day-to-day basis. What are some ways that you have seen that we can do diversity and do equity?
Right. One thing, I play a bit of music, guitar, and a friend of mine last night that I jammed with, she said, "Oh, what are you on play tomorrow?" I'm doing a talk about diversity. "Oh, what are you going to talk about?" I kind of told him where I was coming from. He says, "Oh, what would it mean for a musician to engage in diversity? What does that mean?" And I said, "Well, let's say that this guy is local guy here, so Portuguese, Chinese, Korean descent." And I said, you're playing in a jazz idiom, and you're really immersed in this tradition that goes back in the United States to the 40s and 50s for jazz guitar and coming forward. And I said, but you've got this Korean heritage, and maybe you've been playing in Korea. You've done a couple of gigs in Seoul. And in Korea, they love jazz. But Korea also has this really wonderful improvisational music tradition that sort of It's a storytelling tradition called pansori. It's got a really wonderful vocal style and drumming, kind of improvised on the spot for the audience. And I said, you know, you can imagine inviting yourself into one of those contexts and playing along with it, trying to figure out how you can adapt your jazz sensibilities to what's going on in that context, or invite some of those musicians to work with you, not to play the kind of music you normally play, but to play music you never would have dreamed of playing, but that has elements of what you're familiar with, but brings in elements of what they do. And I mean, I've been in environments musically, playing, for example, with an erhu player, a Chinese erhu player, who tried playing with a bunch of jazz groups and said, every time I play with them, I have to play like I'm playing Western violin. They just don't permit me the space to do what I would do as a Chinese musician. So I said, well, let's work really hard at this. Let's work really hard at being open-ended, complete free improv. No chord changes, no system stuck out in advance, not even choosing a key to play in. Let's just see what happens. We just keep making notes and let it build by itself so that her sensitivities to listening and my sensitivities can merge. So I think when we're talking about diversity as a practice, it's about, I mean, we're using as a metaphor music, but it's about listening to where the other's coming from, to go past this idea that we're going to have something in common, to figuring out in what can we have shares. So I really like the distinction that Jean-Luc Nancy makes between the common and the shared, where common is supposedly something we all have together, a human nature that we all have. And for Nancy, he says, invocations of the common always come with coercion. There's always a disciplinary edge to that. Now, what he says is what we're really looking for is shared community, where like when you have a shared dance, if you're both doing the same thing, dancing together, you're going to step on each other's toes. If you're having a shared dinner and everybody's bringing a dish and everybody brings rice, not a very good potluck. You know, you want some people to bring rice and some to bring a meat dish, a fish dish, vegetables, some dessert, and so on. You bring more to the table that's different in order to create the conditions for sharing. So I think diversity as a practice is trying to develop the sensitivities and sensibilities to be able to contribute to the situations we find ourselves in ways that draw out the contributory virtuosity of those that we're present with. That's the real trick, is being able to listen well enough to get other people to do what will contribute to something that neither of us would have done independently, to get that diversity dividend to really take off. And it's not easy. You can't plan for it. You have to elicit that. It's a relational achievement that comes from those sensitivities and sensibilities.
Awesome, thanks. So I see there's Rachel and then Gershon and then Asia.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm putting my hand down. Hi, I'm Rachel. Thank you so much for speaking today and sharing your time with us. Very much going off of the same wavelength as Ro just talked about, and jumping off of the same piece of work that he was talking about. So based on your ideas on variety versus diversity, which I think are really valuable, by the way, and applying these things to our world today in the here and now, like today in this space we live in, do you think it's possible to orchestrate this self-sustaining, difference-enriching exchange with our current stage of late-stage capitalism society that sustains itself by perpetuating division and classism?
Yeah, I think there's a real challenge there. And it's one of the reasons why at the very end of the talk, I mentioned this algorithmic tailoring of the human experience and the attention economy, because I see that what's going on with smart capitalism as it's being embraced, not just in the US, but in China and everywhere else in the world, smart capitalism is on the rise. And it depends on gathering human data, using that data to be fed through algorithms to figure out how to predict what we will like, what we'll dislike, what we can be encouraged to buy, what we can be encouraged to think, and so on. And we have building awareness today about the dangers of that, about how that can foster divisiveness of a kind that we've seen kind of breaking out in the last 5 years, to the point that, you know, I think the vice CEO of Facebook, Clegg, just I think today released something like a 20-page paper sort of trying to address whether or not Facebook has responsibility for some of the divisiveness and populism that have been associated with social media growth. And he denies it, basically. But I think that it's really pretty much undeniable that if you look at what's happening as we feed people's ideas back to themselves, it's natural that these units will solidify around narrower and narrower ideas. So I think we need to work in resisting that. And for me, freedom of attention is really at the bottom of it all. The attention today is driven by our attention. The economy is driven by our attention. If we don't pay attention, whether it's to e-commerce platforms, social media, the industries start to hurt really badly. It's our data that allows their algorithms to get better at getting us to choose what we already would like. It's not that we're being coerced into buying things. We're being encouraged to give in to our desires and our cravings. And what the machine intelligences are doing, what deep learning is about commercially, is figuring out what you desire. As an individual, what do you desire? What do you fear? What do you long for? Judging your social media posts, given what you say to your friends, given who you are as a person in terms of your purchasing habits and so on, figure out by pairing you with a doppelganger, someone who looks like you, and giving you different suggestions until you can determine where the break point is. Then you find a new doppelganger so that you zero in precisely on predicting what people will do. And these are fabulously productive and effective algorithms. So we need to resist that, I think. I think in another kind of a talk, I'd say that part of this, the social justice today, is the resistance mode. So there's the recognizing that the competing points of view have their merits. And then there's the redirection. We're ready for redirection, but we're not going to be able to redirect unless we resist. So I think now to move forward with social justice, really, we need to resist some of what's going on in the media surrounding issues of social justice because it's polarizing. And it hasn't been productive so far that I've seen. But I'm not saying that we can't use media, but we have to figure out a way of using media that are ironic, that have effects on these monopolistic platform systems. They get them to kind of back down on the algorithmic shaping of our experience. So I think, yes, it's possible, but it's going to take concerted effort to sort of resist the allures, the attractions of what the attention economy is offering us. Smart capitalism is good at its job.
All right, so Gershon, you're next, and then Asia and Yale.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask you two things which relate to my trying to grasp what you're saying and bring it into my own way of thinking. Would it be correct to use the image of Indra's net in the Lankavatara Sutra as a lens for understanding how you see interpersonal relationships? And if so, maybe you could say something about that. The other is that in the beginning of your talk, you spoke about the relationship between ethics and metaphysics, and you made the point, as I see it, that metaphysics is sublimated, or ethics is the grounding for metaphysics. And I tell you, as you were talking more and more, I'm saying to myself, isn't all this based on some metaphysical principles? So those are two queries I would have, and maybe you could address them so you could bring me more into your world there.
Yep. Indra's net, wonderful. I think you find that it's used in the, especially in the East Asian traditions, to talk about non-duality and about interpenetration, interdependence and interpenetration. I mean, as a metaphor, it's a nice one, but metaphors all have their limitations. And one of the limitations with Indra's net is the idea that you've kind of got all these jewels, and the jewels are somehow all the same, and each one of them reflects all the other jewels. So it's a sort of a reflection metaphor for how everything kind of contains everything else. And I much prefer, in the kind of work that I do, drawing on Fazang, who's a Chinese Huayan Buddhist philosopher from 7th, 8th century. And he uses building as a metaphor for interdependence and interpenetration. So his metaphor is traditional timber frame constructed building in China. So these are buildings where you've got, the simplest form would be 4 columns set on stone bases, a set of beams that connect the 4 columns, rafters that fit on top of the perimeter beams, lean against a ridge at the top, purlins across the rafters, roofing tiles on top of that. No nails, no fasteners. Everything is held down by the weight of all of the ingredients that are there. All the wood and the roofing tiles compresses the joints to hold the building together. Okay, so nothing's fastened hard. Everything is relationally fastened through the gravity of everything working together. So Fazang would then say, well, what is a rafter? And you would point up at a rafter and say, well, that's a rafter. He says, well, take it down and put it on the ground. Is it a rafter anymore? It only becomes a rafter when it's serving its function, when it's acting as the cause of the ridge beam being able to be held up. If the rafter doesn't hold the ridge beam up, ridge beam falls. If there's no ridge beam, can't put the purlins on, can't put the tiles on, can't hold the building together. So from Fazang's perspective, each thing is the cause of the totality of all things. Causally, each thing is connected to all other things. So it's not just a reflective situation as you get an inverse net. It's a causal relationship where you get complex network causalities, and we are all implicated in those kind of causalities. And I think for Fazang, this is the idea of non-duality. So Fazang would say, a rafter, a column, the beams, the perimeter beams, the ridge beam, purlins, roofing tiles, they're all the same. They're non-dualistic. How are they non-dualistic? Because they each differ meaningfully from one another. Each is the cause of all the others being what they are. You can't be a roofing tile if you don't have rafters. You can't be a rafter if you don't have roofing tiles, and so on and so forth. So that's where I get the kind of everything is what it means for all others. Each thing is both the cause of and caused by all other things. So I tend to prefer that one to the inverse net just because it's dynamic. The second question was about ethics and metaphysics and whether there wasn't just a metaphysics hiding under all this.
Yeah.
And, I think that it's like words like philosophy, religion, metaphysics, etc. These are all coming out of the Western philosophical tradition, and they don't have exact parallels in Buddhism or in Chinese thought. And you kind of make your best trying to figure out how to use the Western vocabulary to mix in with these other traditions. But I think that the difference I'm trying to get at is that because the cosmos operates karmically, that is, the complexion of our environments in terms of the experiential opportunities and outcomes that we have, everything that we're experiencing is a function ultimately of decisions, intentions that have been put into action based on values at some other point in the past in a network of causalities. So that the world that we find ourselves in doesn't pre-exist intentionality. And the project that we're all involved in is not to figure out what the world is. That's not the Buddhist project. The Buddhist project is we're in a world, it's got conflict, it's got trouble, it's got suffering. Do you like it? I don't like the conflict, trouble, and suffering part of it for sure. Well, let's do something about that. So the Buddhist approach is let's do something about where we find ourselves situated. It's changing the world, changing the course of our conduct as humans, which will then change the environments that we find ourselves present in, that is changing the world. So in Buddhist mythology, early Buddhism started with the idea of kind of a cosmos that's centered on a single mountain and a circular ocean around, and it's vertical and a sort of concentric idea. But with Mahayana Buddhism, they said, you know what, that doesn't really capture the world we live in. I mean, we live in a multiverse. It's like the difference between our concept of universe and the Buddhists are more about a multiverse. You have many different world realms, in each of which it's possible to realize distinctive approaches to liberating relationality. And I think that connects with these ideas about diversity. that it's not just that we're trying to come up with one social system, one form of justice that's going to be good for everybody for all time. Rather, what we want to do is to start wherever we are and to improve the justice that's resident there, to grow it, to change it, to move it forward. Because the idea of A versus B change, it doesn't work in the real world. It's always A to A prime to A double prime to A triple prime. And then maybe at some point you say A with 100 primes after, let's just call the damn thing B. It's changed enough. But that's a vocabulary difference, not about the change dynamics. The change dynamics are always incremental, and they couldn't be otherwise.
So Asia, and then Yale, and then Heather. I think you were muted.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Y'all can hear me now?
Yes.
Great, good. Well, thank you. And I think my question might pick up a little bit on where you just left. I'm trying to kind of think through or work through what the implications are for this kind of this richer, more robust relational concept of diversity for practice and policy in academia. So if I currently understand kind of the aim of diversity in academia as something like bringing diverse students, faculty, and staff right onto campus, maybe for two reasons, or with kind of two purposes in mind. One is to facilitate like diversity in intellectual pursuits, which, you know, we think maybe gives us better views or gets us closer to truth or something like this. And then another reason for diversity, for bringing diverse faculty, staff, and students on campus is to make sure that we're not unjustly excluding, right? So, right, if we have a much larger portion of white students, wealthy students, right, men on campus, that indicates that we're, you know, doing something wrong in our admissions process. And then maybe like the second part of that is, so we want to get diverse folks on campus for these various reasons. And then we want to, you know, make sure or help them thrive once they're on campus. And we might think that, again, this is for two reasons. Maybe that's what we owe, right? People once they get to campus. And a much more cynical kind of reason would be that it's not sustainable to bring diverse folks to campus or diverse groups to campus and not, you know, make sure that we're meeting their basic, not even basic, but treating them kindly, right, or compassionately, or helping them thrive. And so I can imagine a whole bunch of practices and policies that fall out of, right, that kind of model or concept of diversity. And I'm trying to kind of, again, work through, like, what is the, again, this richer notion of diversity that you're bringing, like, what is that add that isn't maybe captured by that existing understanding of diversity? And you've gotten us a lot, and I guess I'm just asking for kind of an articulation conceptually, but then also like maybe some examples of practices and policies that might be really different on the ground with this different understanding.
Now, I think that the closest term that I heard you use that sort of resonates with my understanding of diversity is the word thrive. The conditions for bringing students on the campus and having them thrive. And what does it mean to thrive? It's not just survive. It's something in addition to that. So it's a qualitative assessment. It's not just getting by. It's not just getting grades. There's some qualitative integration of the student into the life of the campus, academically as well as socially. That it's about the equity of quality of inclusion. Just getting the student on campus isn't good enough. And allowing students to pair up in groups that are natural identity affiliations, I think is easy to do. I was at Yale when the first Black students were starting to come on campus in significant numbers. And when they started coming on, they had their tables in the lunchroom, Black tables. And then you had some of the other tables, the Asian tables. And it was miserable. I mean, there's no integration, there's no interaction. So they're on campus, but not being integrated in. What can you do about that? Well, I think that the standard approach is you create teams and you put people into teams, making them responsible for some shared output. So if you want to kind of read a little bit about the sociology of this, there's a guy named Scott Page who wrote a book called, I'm spacing on the name, but if you do a search for Scott Page diversity, I mean, basically his claim is that, based on a lot of studies that have been done, that if you get a group of experts working on a problem that is discipline specific, that's resolvable within an existing research paradigm, a group of experts will always outperform a mixed group of people. But if it's a issue that requires some kind of a research paradigm shift, then a group of non-experts, a multidisciplinary group, will outperform the group of experts. So an example would be that he uses in his book, a research group that's trying to find a new physical structure for lightweight aircraft. They've got the metallurgists who've been working on this, and they've been working on it for a long time. And they've come up with super lightweight metals that have the resilient flexibility and strength and so on, that function in aircraft and so on, but it's not there yet. It's just not light enough. And so they put together this interdisciplinary group where you had people from biology as well as metallurgy, physics, etc. And it was somebody that worked in biology who came up with the idea that the physical geometry of seashells allowed calcium, which is not particularly strong, to be put into a form where it had tremendous resistance to external pressures, so bottom of the seafloor. So he had the idea, what if we can develop a metal that at the microstructure has the structure, the geometry of these calcite organisms? And the metallurgy guys are going, why did we never think of that? You know? So I think that the point of Page in these kind of examples is that the diversity dividend is entirely new kind of thinking about something based on people having very different kinds of expertise, but coming together to resolve a shared interest. So I think one of the things that could happen on campuses, for example, we think about the contemporary American college campus as being a kind of a melting pot of people from a lot of different places, typically. Up until now, many campuses were relying, as I'm sure American University did, on foreign students for full paid tuition and so on. But I think what we could do is we could take an issue like the war in Afghanistan and talk about Middle East relations, what's going on in international affairs, and bring together students who's either refugees from or parents have come from Afghanistan or the region, people whose parents have been subject to the kinds of terrorization by the American military that America has foisted on people, American veterans, people have served in the region, maybe someone who's lost a leg doing it, who's still patriotic. Bring them together and have them try to work through the predicament of geopolitics. It's about oil, it's about land, it's about what is it about? It's about ideology. Work together with the students to try to figure out, given the extraordinarily different perspectives that you're coming from on this, how can we arrive at a shared understanding of what to do to make things better in the region? So I think that it's interesting with the notion of diversity that the diversity naturally in the natural world is not greatest in the middle of an ecosystem. Diversity, species diversity is greatest in the ecotone where two different or more ecosystems overlap. In an ecosystem, species, generally speaking, don't compete with each other. Inside a species, there's competition for reproduction and food and so on and so forth. But species have differentiated themselves in such a way that they're making use of resources within that environment in a way that no other species is doing, and that's what gives them their niche. That's what defines their niche. So they're contributing to the dynamics as a whole by doing that. In the ecotones, you get species that are adapted to the same environments, and now the species do start to compete. So what's interesting about that is diversity is greatest under conditions of conflict, but with incentives to figure out how to end the conflict, how to coexist comfortably and productively. So I think we too often avoid discussions of very conflictual or highly charged issues with students in a public format. Maybe privately people are doing it, but to do that in a public format where we're saying, look, this is important. And we can create the compass as an ecotone where these competing views can actually put together in a way that can have ramifications off campus. So for me, part of the diversity coefficient is if everything is relational, we're talking about relationships among students, faculty, staff, etc. But it's also the relationship between the university or college and the community around it. Is the college community, the university community, contributing to the dynamics of the environment that it's part of, the nearby neighborhood, social, etc.? If it's not acting as a diverse partner within the economic social system of that environment. So I think that we have to look both internally and externally. And so sometimes getting students to thrive is really giving them a chance to express themselves as valued and valuable members of their community, speaking on behalf of the community outside of it. So taking your students, for example, and going to local high schools and saying, look, we've got these students who are really from different areas, and they're going to model for you what it's like to have a really tough discussion about something really important in live format. It's not scripted. And to do it under the conditions of kind of safety, where you know at the end of the day, we're in this together. We have a purpose here. We're not trying to overwrite anybody's position. So like I said, the middle path strategy, recognize the merit of every one of these positions that's being brought to the table. There is some merit to every one of these positions, no matter how difficult it may be for us to accept that at times. But then to go to everybody and say, but you can't universalize that. That doesn't work for everybody. And so how do we redirect our energy, this conflicted energy? How can we productively move it in a new direction? What can we comfortably do? So kind of concrete example, drawn from the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka a generation ago, where there were Buddhist, Muslim, Christian conflicts, religious conflicts in the village level. And the idea was, well, we want to get rid of these conflicts. What are we going to do? Let's get a common project. Let's go into the community and ask people, what do we need? First, they had to get over the idea that only the people who are the village heads or the heads of the community got to speak. They had to kind of break it up, identify who the heads are, put them in one room, then try to talk to everybody else. Talk to everybody else and say, what do you really need? Not what do the village heads think you need. What do you really need? We need a well. We need, a sanitation ditch. We need, okay, what do we need in order to get a dig? How are we going to dig this? How much do we need? Do we need shovels? Do we need machines? What do we need? Well, it'd be really great if we had this, and start pulling the resources together and everybody works together on it. Interestingly, in those villages, conflict really got reduced because people are working together. So having a shared goal, an aim to work on together is really useful. And then I think often we miss on campuses, and we miss it in the workplace. I mean, I'm on the DEI committee here at the East-West Center, and top on the list of complaints among people, we did a survey, top on the list of complaints was lack of transparency. The administration makes decisions, the executive board makes decisions, they do not consult. You just hear it, you find out about it. Or if they do consult, they don't seem to have listened. It was pro forma. And so it's not just about transparency, it's being about given an opportunity to contribute something to the center. That's what people want to do. We need to open space for that to happen. And I think that's the quality of inclusion part. Figuring out how do I need to differ as a supervisor to allow the people I supervise to contribute more than they have been, because they want to. It's my job to figure out how I differ as a supervisor, to figure out how they can make a difference for the organization as a whole. That takes ingenuity on my part. takes sensitivity, sympathy, a whole bunch of things from me. A lot of people in leadership positions are not there. So I think we need training on that level, but I think joint activity is really the key to it, improvising on something together. Sorry to be so long-winded.
Well, we've got about 10 minutes left of Q&A. We've got 4 hands up, Yale, Heather, Grace, and Jody. I wonder if you could each pose your questions, your thoughts, and Peter, maybe you can take some notes and then kind of pitch in the middle of them in some way, or answer what it is that you can. But this way we get y'all's 4 voices in the mix. So Yale first.
Yeah. So I guess I kind of had a question as sort of a follow-up of what was last asked and what you last said. So, you know, talking about diversity in college campuses and trying to diversify social and political structures. The way I understand diversity, it brings marginalized people into an inherently oppressive system, which at best accomplishes very little and at worst further traumatize them. At one point, you were talking about how having, for example, refugees from a war in a situation, talking about their experience could help enlighten other people. But something I found in a lot of college class settings is somebody who is a Palestinian refugee is asked to debate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Someone who is, you know, a refugee or is the only, you know, is the only person of a marginalized community is asked to relate their experience, which is, again, oftentimes traumatizing. Is there, I'm sure this isn't what, is there any practical ways that we can institute diversity without making it, putting it on the only people who've actually experienced, the only people who've actually experienced an issue. I'm not phrasing this well, but I guess, can you just clarify what you meant by that?
Yeah, thanks. Emphasizing the burden. Who pays the burden or bears the burden of this integration? Heather.
Okay. Thank you for coming to talk today. I really enjoyed the book, and I thought it brings like a refreshing. I think it refreshes the diversity conversation we're always having. But my question was, how do you deal with people who are opposed to practicing this, are opposed to interdependence? Not in like a psychopathic kind of way, but kind of like just in a selfish way. They just don't care, or they're extremists. Like, how do you even begin to like cultivate a relational dynamic with someone like that, especially if you are the marginalized, like part of the marginalized community that they are against or their views are in opposition to?
Thanks. Grace?
Hi, thank you for coming to see us and talk to us today. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this movement to decolonize academia. It often looks like adding more people of color to syllabi and adding more courses that maybe a school doesn't teach yet that are less Western focused. But that doesn't really fit into your category of what diversity is. That's more just variety. So how can we decolonize academia while also diversifying curricula and academia as a whole? And how can students have a role in that?
And lastly, Jody. Jody, where are you?
Hi. My questions are kind of similar. I'd like to preface with thank you for speaking to us, and that your notion on the algorithmic tailoring of the human existence, that really stood out to me. Good play on words. So having grown up, being raised by my mom to understand this smart capitalism, how human data is being collected, and how we are encouraged to give into our desires and our cravings, such as our desire to end suffering, it perpetuates the suffering because now there exists a space between the suffering now and the cessation of suffering as it may exist outside and exist at another time apart from the present. So your lecture was describing my entire life purpose. And my question is, how can a 22-year-old such as myself take the nature of interdependency, interpenetration, non-duality, and consciousness, having maybe experienced like one time, I don't know, but transform into something like actionable? I know you touched on this, but like practical steps to take and help just the human species, just like all sentient beings and just maximize my time here on Earth. Not in like a selfish way, but just, it's like kind of like the opposite, like kind of like transcending like this I that I say I and myself, because it's so much more than that. It's like advancing or just like prolonging like consciousness.
All right, Peter, it's all you.
Okay. For Yael, it's a really good question about whether or not bringing those who have been marginalized into a majority situation and asking them to then be spokespersons for whatever it is that they're representing, whether it's an ethnic group or a class of people or what have you. It's one thing to give people a voice, and it's another thing to force them to speak. And we don't want to force people to speak. So there has to be a level of comfort where things are drawn out of folks. And one thing that I don't think anybody should be meant to do is to stand for, represent, speak on behalf of an entire group like all Palestinians. People will often ask me questions like, well, what do the Chinese think about X? You've spent lots of time in China. You've been there 15, 20 times. What do Chinese think about X? It's 1.4 billion people. They think lots of things about X, you know, more than I could ever have time to tell you. But you can kind of summarize. You can pull out some threads. So I think with students especially, it's important first to say, if all you're comfortable is talking about is your personal experience, that is valuable. It gives us a very high definition, granular understanding of something much bigger. If you take this sort of Fazang idea about the house, maybe this person is really just one roofing tile, but the experience of a roofing tile is really important for how the whole thing holds together. And if you start to draw out the causalities, then you can start to see how this connects with that, etc. So I think that getting the sharing to start taking place, a lot of it's about asking really good questions, like the questions you guys are asking. I mean, you're asking me to formulate response to the things that I take for granted now. I don't even think about it anymore. I just sort of say this stuff. And so you're asking me to come up with examples, and it's really good. But that's what we need to do with the students too. Encourage them to kind of look at themselves and really feel for the answers. And I think part of it is, especially if we're dealing with something that's difficult, affectively, emotionally, which are the most important things that we're going to deal with, always are going to have that dimension. That it has to be that we encourage people to look deeper into themselves than they normally do. Often people talk from up here and their tongue goes into action, and that's it. And so I've run a couple of symposiums here at the East-West Center where they're discussion-based. So these are symposia that are based on the Greek notion of a symposium as a drinking party where you get together and have good conversation. So the idea is we bring people together and no papers are presented. We tell people in advance, do not come and say things you've said for years. We've read it all already. We don't want to hear it. We want you to come and improvise live with other people. So we put them in a room, and the first thing we do is say, we're going to have a moment of silence. It's going to be an extended moment of silence where we all listen to each other breathing. For 5 minutes, we're just going to breathe together. And whoever has the impulse to start speaking, start speaking. But we're going to give it 5 minutes. You'd be amazed at how conversations change when a bunch of academics and people from the technology world sit together and don't do anything for 5 minutes. It's a different energy in the room. So I think we can experiment with stuff like that in classrooms as well, to create this shared experience from the beginning on something that's as simple as breathing together, that we're all doing anyway, but that we're not aware that we're doing it with each other. We're breathing stuff that's been in each other's lungs. Think about it, you know, in 5 minutes in a closed room, that's what COVID's about. We're breathing what's been inside of your body. That's pretty damn intimate. So as long as we sit there and feel that, I think we start to change the way we relate. Heather, dealing with opposition. One of the stories that I read a number of years back, so forgive me if I got some of the details wrong, is from Nelson Mandela's time when he was imprisoned. And you know about Nelson Mandela, so why he's imprisoned. The white guards at the prison did not want to give anybody an inch. There's beatings, there's violence, and the prisoners themselves had a lot of hatred for the white prison guards, for the white institution, for the country. That's why most of them were in jail. And Mandela says, you know, I was full of hate. I was just so full of hate. I wanted out and I wanted to change things, and I was stuck inside these walls. And at a certain point, I realized if I kept hating, it wasn't going to go anywhere. I needed to do something different. I was going to kill myself. Maybe not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, I would die if I continued to hate this much. So he had a simple idea. He decided he wanted to raise some plants, to grow some little food items. So he asked the guards, he says, if my wife brings me seeds, can I use the yard to plant? No, it's against the rules. Never been done. I'll make the long story short. Over a period of time, he was trying to engage 2 or 3 of the guards and get them to say, look, it's just a little plot of land. All we need is our hands and some water, and we're going to grow these plants. Couldn't make any headway until he asked one of the guards, look, I want to grow plants because I don't have my kids here. My children have been taken away from me by putting me in prison. I can't nurture anything here. Part of what it means to be human is to nurture. I can't nurture my children. Let me nurture a plant. Don't you have children? And the guard said, yeah, I've got kids. Don't you yearn to nurture your children and see them grow? And isn't that the best part of yourself? The guards, yeah, maybe you're right. Don't you want to allow me to give the best part of myself a chance to grow it even in these walls? And the guard's like, all right, you got your water, you got your land. And things started to change, not just for Mandela, but for other prisoners who sort of saw him, made fun of him. What are you doing with your little plants? You know, Mr. Tough Guy, you know, revolutionary. But they got into it. They got into it too, because to nurture something to help it grow is healing. So I think, you know, if we're talking about opposition, it means meeting them somewhere. There is somewhere where we can meet, maybe not the psychopaths, the total sociopathic, you know, clinically gone, but even for the most diametrically opposed people, we can usually find something we connect on and to start building from there. Unfortunately, that takes a lot of courage, and it means being vulnerable. And it's hard to insist that people be vulnerable, because to deal with people who are strongly in opposition to where we're coming from, you got to be ready to take it. And I would recommend ahead of time doing enough mindfulness training to be able to, when the negative energy starts to come up, that you can control your own negative response. Because it's really necessary in that kind of work. Because once it starts, the shouting match, metaphorically speaking, once that starts, it's gone downhill. For Grace, decolonizing the curriculum. You know, part of my career has been focused on promoting Asian studies on American college campuses. And it's been really interesting work because, you know, at good campuses, schools like American University, there's always been the possibility of doing Chinese history or Japanese literature or what have you. But most colleges across the United States 20 years ago, 30 years ago when we started this, you could get an undergraduate degree and never hear the word China or Thailand in your classroom. You could be asked, where is Indonesia? Wouldn't be able to find it on a map. Wouldn't know that it was the largest Muslim country in the world. And our feeling was, it's scandalous that people grow up in this way. And why is it like that? Because Asia and the study of the colonized world in general has been considered an elective. It's an elective, something you can do if you want to. It's there. Take the classes if you want. Women's studies, you don't have to take it, but it's there if you want to take it. Gender studies, it's there if you want to take it. Study an Asian tradition, it's there if you want to take it. But the academy was ghettoized. The people who wanted to take it would do it. Otherwise, nobody bothered. So our model was take Asia and infuse it into every class that every student takes. No matter what class it is. It could be Intro to Sociology, unit on the Japanese family. You know, it could be international relations, stuff on, you know, Chinese international relations, politics, Tianxia theory, and so on. It's a way of saying any class at any level can have Asian content responsibly infused into it. And I think that's really the approach to take, infusing these new perspectives into what we're always doing, as opposed to saying, well, when you feel like a little diversity fix, you can go to this meeting. That's not going to work. It can't be that. It has to be part of everything we're doing. Now, that means making some choices, because the pushback from within the academy, and this goes back long time ago to Harold Bloom and his, you know, worries about the loss of the American mind because we're moving away from that core curriculum. Yeah, we're going to lose that. We're going to lose something. We gain immeasurably more. So I think that it's a matter really of having people who are trained well enough in the discipline to be able to warrant the importance of bringing these other voices and perspectives in, and to say, look, this actually measures up to our standards. If you're talking about we're not doing as much Shakespeare as we used to because we're studying Japanese love poetry, well, guess what? Here's why. And here's what the Japanese love poetry connects to. And it's as rich, if not richer, than what was connected to in the human experience with Shakespeare. It's not a zero-sum game where you have to choose one or the other. Then put him into conversation. So then you watch a Kenzaburo Oe film where he takes a Shakespearean play and he adapts that for a Japanese context as a samurai movie. What's going on with that kind of blending? So I think that the idea of decolonizing is really great. And I'll just go to my final statement from Jody, the question about the attention economy, and say the real worry is not about the colonized academy, it's about the colonization of consciousness, because that's what's going on with the attention economy. It is our consciousness that is being colonized. It's not a land grab, it's a time grab. It's all about taking our time, keeping it connected, because our data carries our intelligence. The choices that we make, how long we pay attention to things on screen, everything is being quantified and used to figure out how to get us to do what a commercial or a state interest would want us to do. It is the single greatest threat to humanity that exists today. Nothing is a bigger threat, because if we don't have freedom of attention, like I said at the end of the talk, we don't have freedom of intention. If we don't have freedom of intention, we can't change our course responsibly in a way that is interactive and responsive to the situation that we find ourselves in. That means ethics is impossible. So it's not, people talk a lot about technology and the idea that we're going to approach a technological singularity, the point when an artificial superintelligence takes off and perhaps renders humanity either obsolete or extinct. It's a worry, and it's prudent to worry about that in the scientific horizon. Depends who you talk to. It's 30 years out, 300 years out. We don't know. I think long before then, in the next decade or two, we will reach an ethical singularity, a point at which the evaluation of value systems assumes infinite value, where if we don't make some choices now about how to conserve our freedom of attention, we're eventually going to find ourselves in a position where we are no longer able to deal with our own human conflicts, because this technology, intelligent technology, is scaling up human intentions. Your intentions, my intentions, the things I wish for, the things I want to buy, the things the military wants, things non-state actors want. It's indiscriminately scaling up all of our human conflicts. And we will get to a point eventually where we will not be able to escape the summative effect of all of our human conflicts, because it'll be fed back to us repeatedly. What can we do? You're a young person, you're 22 years old. I would suggest organizing data strikes, not data fast, where you as an individual say, oh, I'm going to do without social media for a week to detox from being in the specular society, you know, the society of I'm always on display for others. I'm not going to be on display for people. That's data fasting. Personally beneficial, probably. A data strike is different. It's like a hunger strike. What do you want? What are the terms? When are you going to get back on using data? What do you want in return for giving people your data? When we give our time and attention through the attention economy, it's not a fair exchange. We lose our data and our attention. We lose our time. We don't get it back. The corporations and the states, they get a lot from it. So what can we do? We can have terms of agreement. If Facebook or Google or Amazon or Tencent or Alibaba in China, if you're not going to use 10% of your revenues, pick a number, a percentage to do research and development on addressing issues of diversity and inclusion worldwide, then we're not going to use your platform. And we will disrupt your uses by not using your platform on a mass basis, on a regular terms, so that your algorithms can't grow. We've got the control because you need our data. Without our data, you don't improve what you're doing. Your business model's shot. It's possible to do that if you organize at mass. College students, I think there's something like, is it 250 million worldwide? Something like that, college-age students. It's a lot of people. It's not China, it's not 1.4 billion, but it's a lot of people. In the United States, I think there's probably a good couple, 4 or 5 million at least, college students. It's a lot of people. It makes a difference, organized. Can't do anything alone. We have to collaborate.
Well, on that rousing note, let's thank our speaker. I wish we could give you more of an auditory experience of that. Thanks everybody for your questions, comments, etc., for showing up, for having your videos on. Appreciate that. And again, Peter Hershock, thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks for inviting me. It was great having the question and answer. And I know that often with talks like these, I've been to, the people they use up their full hour of talking, and then you get the squeezed, discussion time. And I just feel like if you're talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, and you talk for an hour and don't listen to what other people are interested in, you're kind of not living up to your own word. So hopefully it worked out fine for you.